welcome you to the second day of the two-day International Interdisciplinary Conference titled Communities, Cultures and Environment, Forging Interactions and Identity. This conference has been organized to celebrate the 100 years of our esteemed department and university. We are honored to have each and every one of you here with us today. Over the course of the last day, we have had the privilege of hearing from a diverse array of speakers and experts, exploring the intersections of culture, community and environment. Today, we continue this important dialogue, delving deeper into the ways in which these concepts shape our world and influence our identity. We are confident that the discussions and interactions that will take place today will be both enriching and thought-provoking. Once again, we extend our warmest welcome and gratitude to all our attendees. Thank you for joining us for this momentous occasion, and we look forward to a productive and inspiring day ahead. It is my pleasure to introduce the first session of the day, themed as Religiosity and Sites of Identity Formation. This session will be chaired by the esteemed Professor Vijayalaxmi Singh. Professor Vijayalaxmi Singh is currently the Professor at the Department of History, University of Delhi. Formerly, she was the BY Director in charge, CPDHE, UGC, HRDC, Delhi University. In addition, she was also the CI, COPS Scholar and Fellow at the University of Padua, in 2007 and 2012 respectively. She specializes in ancient Indian history, archaeology, culture and gender. Her publications include Jain, numismatics and epigraphy studies, Mathura, the settlement pattern and cultural profile of an early historical city, the saga of first urbanism, Harappan civilization, to name a few. We are privileged to have a distinguished panel of speakers joining us today. Our first speaker is Dr. Ranjeeta Dutta, who will be sharing her insights on the religious leaders, community identities, and mapping the urban, changing contours of the temple towns of Srirangam in medieval South India. Our second speaker, Professor Shalin Jain, will be exploring renovations and contestations, Śatrunjaya, through the ages. Finally, we have Dr.Patrick Felix Krüger, who will be discussing Jina and Jina images, how images contribute to the construction of religious founder figures. I would now like to welcome our first speaker for this session, Dr. Ranjeeta Dutta, teaches at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her areas of interest are the history of religion and ideas of region, and specializes in medieval and early modern India. She has been a fellow at Max Weber College, University of Erfurt, Germany, and at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Her publications, in addition to essays in journals and edited volumes, include a monograph, From Hagiographies to Biographies, Ramanuja in Tradition and History, an edited special issue of Summerhill IIS Shimla titled Regions, Identities and Entangled Geography, and a co-edited volume titled Negotiating Religion, Perspectives from Indian History. Dr. Dutta currently is also a member of the editorial collective of the Medieval History Journal. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for this introduction. organizers of this conference for inviting me to such a distinguished program, which is the Centenary of Delhi University. University with, which has helped us in shaping our learning. We have grown up here in our undergraduate and postgraduate studies. So I really feel very honored and very small, standing in front of so many of you, where I have been one of the students in my undergraduate days. The title of my talk is Religious Leaders, Community Identities and Mapping the Urban. And I am going to talk about it in reference to a town in Tamil Nadu, whose name is Srirangam, on which I have been working now for some years and plan to now wrap it up. This has been with me for quite some time, and every time I visit and revisit my sources, I find something which I thought I had missed. So I decided to present some of what my findings are here today to all of you and get your feedback, which I look forward to, for it will help me to shape my monograph on this town. Now, in a 1919 essay in the Modern Review, Patrick, the famous Scottish town planner, through his scholarship has coined a phrase, the temple cities, with reference to southern India, mainly in the Tamil region. According to Geddes, the gigantic structure of the temple held the entire settlement of the city or town together where the temple was situated, providing a focal point in the spatial layout. Geddes was of course interested in the planning of these towns, dominated by their respective temples. However, thereafter, the study of these towns was limited to mere sacred centers, described as pilgrimage sites with devotional importance. And the temples situated in them were illustrated with architectural and religious details. The understanding of sacred spaces as urban centers is often marginalized in various studies on cities and urbanization in Indian history, especially where the medieval period is concerned from the 13th century onwards. It is asserted here in this presentation and also in my larger research, which is in progress, that no strict dichotomy between the sacred and the secular is possible. Religion is part of the organization of the secular space and urban processes, resulting in the growth of the town, involving not only a study of economic factors, but also an engagement with religious ideologies and community identities. The present presentation will examine the interface between the Sri Vaishnava Mathajiyas, Acharyas, and the temple at Srirangam from the 13th to the 17th centuries. How do I go backwards? Yeah, thank you. Through an analysis of inscriptions and temple records, it will be demonstrated that the religious leaders made claims over the land surrounding the town and appropriated certain rituals and ritual paraphernalia, all of which had consequences for the spatial layout and urbanity in Srirangam. These claims were legitimized through the introduction of new festivals, whose processions marked a particular route, while enabling the religious leaders to appropriate sites and spaces as a part of their institutional base, which was located within the temple. The second theme that I would be talking about is that the temple became a significant site for contestations and negotiations, sometimes leading to a shift in the sacred power structure that impacted the sources of patronage. The temple records show that such claims were, of course, often led to the incorporation of agrarian settlements and also the various groups associated with them, altering not only the spatial layout of the town but also its demographic composition. This interaction between the religious leaders, temples, and various social groups also provided an important source for the Jiers and the Acharyas for acquiring disciples, which influenced significantly the community identity. Now, I begin with the religious leaders, their history and their participation in the urban process. Some of it will be very brief, which I hopefully would be able to sort of clarify in the question and answer session. Now, situated in the district of Tiruchirappalli, this is the river, Kaveri River, and this is very important, very crucial for the town of Srirangam. Srirangam is an island town surrounded by river Kaveri and co-rivers, and it's approximately 7 kilometers from the town of Tiruchirappalli. The urban landscape of Srirangam is dominated by a gigantic temple called the Ranganatha Swami Temple or the Pediyakol. The Ranganatha Swami Temple of Vishnu is one of the most important temples for the Sri Vaishnava community of South India. The presence of the temple accentuates the antiquated sacred character of Srirangam that has been regarded as one of the most important pilgrimage centers along with Kanchipuram and Tirupati. Now, the entire landscape of the town, with the establishment of the Vijayanagar rule in the Tamil region, was dotted with various mutts, smaller shrines, especially on the outskirts of the town, and the presence of numerous religious leaders, along with a lot of addition to the temple. And some of these leaders had a significant presence within the temple and in the town itself. These are well documented in the inscriptions and the temple chronicle, the Koil Olu. However, two families with a lineage that dominated the urban and the sacred landscape of the town, and about whom I will be talking here today. There were several, but I picked up these two because they were dominant. These two groups or these two families were one, Uttama Nambis, and the second, the Kandaidas. Now, the Kandaidas had a wide spread network with other towns, especially Tirupati. And Uttama Nambis were a little more, Srirangam oriented. Now, these two families claimed a religious lineage that became the basis of their assertion at Srirangam and elsewhere too. Now, the Uttama Nambis claimed their ancestry from one of the Vaishnava Alvars called Peri Alvar around 6th-7th century, who is supposed to have migrated from Srivillikuttur, which is in the southern part, to Srirangam, thus projecting an exclusive lineage with an independent identity. Now, according to the temple chronicle, the Uttama Nambis have been one of the most ancient families at Srirangam. The epigraphs tell us that by 16th century, there were more than 73 generations of them managing the temple. The rising power of the Uttama Nambis was first evident in 15th century, 1413, where the entire management of the temple festivals was entrusted to them. The concerned inscriptions convey a royal order which enjoined that there would be no official participation in the management of these festivals because the Uttama Nambis would now be managing them. Therefore, it was evident that the temple control was not totally in their hands. And it is from their time that the temple gained prominence, recorded a large number of donations from the royalty who were actually the benefactors of the Uttama Nambis. Now, gradually they started occupying places in the temple administration which were usually managed by non-religious leaders. Those people were usually the representatives of the Vijayanagar state. So the Uttama Nambis became the Sthanika or the Shrikarim officers of the temple. They became so powerful that on the behalf of other Matha leaders, they started receiving lands. And the income from these lands were utilized for various services which were now instituted within the temple. In return, we find that the royal patronage, the Vijayanagar patronage, made the Uttama Nambis and their families as the whole sole custodian of the temple, exempting them from payments of taxes on the lands which were granted to them. The Koil ascribes to the Uttama Nambis the role of the representative of Srirangam temple to the Vijayanagar court. They also actively participated in some of the important decisions in the affairs of the temple. and the town around it. For example, the 79th Uttama Nambi, Krishnaraya, our 14th century inscription tells us, settled a boundary dispute between the Shaivas who had a temple close by, which is Tiruvanelka, and the Sri Vaishnavas of Srirangam. Further, the poet Olugu attributes the role of mediator to the Uttama Nambis during the conflicts between various groups in the temple. Very often, they also try to appropriate power and privileges, and they also interfere in the domestic matters, in the household matters of the various religious leaders during this period about who should be adopting children or whose children and so on. Not much is known about the Uttama Nambis from the mid-15th century AD. It's obvious that they lost their importance because their inscriptions also do not make any reference to them. In fact, the Temple Chronicles record that one of the later Uttama Nambis became the follower of another group, which is the Kandadis. Therefore, it appears that they lost their independent identity as religious leaders by the 16th century at Srirangam. Now we have the second family, the Kandadi family, which claims its descent from the 11th, 12th century saint Ramanuja. And one of their ancestors is supposed to have bought the mace of authority from none other than Vishnu, himself. And that's the legend which has been cited often when they have to make claims over authority and control in the various temple centers, particularly at Srirangam. And the first reference to the Kandadis happened to be in 12th century in the temple. And it was in the 15th century, after the decline of the Uttama Nambis, that Kandadi family was on the rise. And one of their members, the most important member, was Kandadi Ramanuja Iyengar, who was patronized by the Vijayanagar ruler Saluva Narasimha. The rise in the power of the Kandadis was actually due to the creation of an institution which is called Ramanuja Kootam. And this Ramanuja Kootam was a very important institution within the temple, which became a source of power and authority because it was a feeding hall where the pilgrims would collect at a certain point of time. It was a place where everyday life cycle, rituals and religious discourses were conducted, thereby providing a space for community interaction. And it is here that the Kandadi Ramanuja Iyengar was able to gradually collect disciples and marginalize the power of the Uttama Nambis. And it gave them several opportunities to interact with the powerful political leaders who visited the temple. The epigraphical evidence points out that from the mid-16th century, the Kandadis were major donors to the temple and recipients of several shares during important occasions. Now, Kandadi Ramanuja Iyengar, whose reference we find repeatedly in the inscriptions, developed his own group of disciples, the Shartada Sri Vaishnavas, who were non-Brahmins and were involved in all the administrative matters of Ramanuja Kootam. Now, by the virtue of their association with the Kandadis, the Shartadas received numerous privileges, which I will be discussing in a short while. In fact, being in charge of Ramanuja Kootam gave the Kandadis so much of power that he executed his own grant and was the first Sri Vaishnava to be empowered, to distribute the offerings to his disciple, which used to be done by the temple functionaries before, who would apportion the prasadam or the offerings. Alright, so we find that such was the power of the Kandadi during this period. By the end of the 17th century, they also lost their influence at Srirangam. This is primarily because they also started losing royal patronage, and other religious leaders start coming in, like the Tatacharyas, who were actually patronized by the Nayakas during this period. Now, the rising influence of these two families, Uttama Nambis and Kandadis, brought in certain aspects that influenced the nature of urban settlements. Before the 13th and the 14th century, most of the land granted to the temple at Srirangam was along the northern banks of river Kaveri, which was close to the temple. And these were mostly Brahmadaya settlements, which were created at the initiative of the Pandya rulers, who were briefly here after the decline of the Cholas. However, from 14th century onwards, we find find when the Uttamanambis came on the scene, the land granted was along the southern and western banks of Kaveri, clearly indicating an expansion of the hinterland. The earlier settlements were dominated by flower garden, for whom the land was mainly granted by the members of the royal family, political elites and merchants. And now more and more land was granted for paddy cultivation, settlement of their own landed properties, that is of the religious leaders, which was located in these areas. We also find that Uttamanambis and Kandaris seem to possess their own land, which they were selling to the political elites and taking money, and this land was then donated by the elites to the temple for its upkeep and ritual paraphernalia. So we have a considerable expansion of the hinterland, which brought new groups to the temples. However, the hinterland was just not merely a resource providing area. It also became an area where Uttamanambis and Kandaris would expand their control. There are numerous inscriptions which talk about various festivals, particularly the car festival, where the chariot was taken to all these places. The repair of the chariot took place at a huge expense in the 15th century, which shows that, this is what I assume, that probably the chariot was going to travel longer distances. And at various points it halted. And these points are very crucial because these were the points where Uttamanambis and Kandaris and their disciples visited and made land grants, and in turn received honors and many authority privileges. So this entire route through which this festival chariot moved marked a certain area of control and movement of these religious leaders integrating newer areas and settlements. Now I come to the last part of my presentation about how the presence of these leaders influenced the urbanity, or let us say the town's life during this period. Now this is a period where we have large number of migrations from the Deccan taking place to the Tamil region, particularly to the river valley areas. And you have Telugu warriors, landed magnates, all of them coming to this place, and there's an evolution of a very strong non-Brahminical identity. Most of them, of course, became very major benefactors of this temple. And we find that there is a notion of Guru Shishya relationship which came to be highlighted in the hagiographies and the religious texts of the Sri Vaishnavas, which was practically enacted by an urge to acquire devotees as much as possible. Therefore, the Kandaris, started, particularly more than Uttamanambis, started acquiring a large part of non-Brahmins as a section of their deity because they controlled Ramanuja Kutam, unlike the Uttamanambis who controlled the interior part of the temple. Now, most of these disciples are non-Brahmins of the Kandaris. They are called Ekakis, Ekangis, and Shakada Shrivastavas, who figure prominently as the recipient of several shares in temple offerings. Epigraphical evidence of Srirangam highlights the presence of Shakada Sri Vaishnavas in temple services, and the first recorded evidence at Srirangam is in 15th century, and it records a grant of land to the temple by a Shakada Sri Vaishnava from Pratapgiri in Uttar Pradesh. Now, I really could not find out what this Uttar Pradesh is. Is it from the Deccan region, or is it from what we today popularly call the northern part of the country? According to such scholars, the Shakadas were previously Brahmins who renounced their sacred thread, removed their top knot, and stopped performing Vedic rites in favor of temple services. So there were two types of Shudra groups that participated in the administration: the Shakada Sri Vaishnavas, who were actually householders, and the Shakada Ekakis, who were non-Brahmin renunciates. Subsequently, they became prominent under Kandari Ramanuja Dasar or Kandari Ramanuja Iyengar. And we find that the reference of Kandari with Ramanuja Kutam as their power base and the Shakadas also in Tirupati very, very prominently. So subsequently, Kandari Ramanuja Iyengar seems to have emerged as a powerful person who supervised temple repair works, was the trustee of gold treasury, and built and managed the Ramanuja Kutam. He is also referred to Kandade Ramanuja Iyengar, a Shaktada Parama Ekangi, indicating that he was influential not only at Srirangam, and this title is also found in the inscriptions at Tirupati, which means that he had a pan-local presence in this period. One of the records registered that he donated 2 villages in Tondai Mandalam, which is the northern part of Tamil Nadu, to Ranganatha, for offerings and to feed the Sri Vaishnava Brahmins, in a particular monastery. The influence of Kandade seems to have increased by the 15th century, and we find that it is at this period, just 5 minutes, and it seems that, the Sri Vaishnava non-Brahmins also flourished in this period. It seems that his disciple Kandade Madhava Iyengar inherited this office, but by the 16th century, as the position of the Kandades started declining, so did the status of the Shaktada Sri Vaishnavas or the non-Brahmins decline, and there hardly any reference to the administrative involvement in the temple. Now, some scholars are of the opinion that the gradual decline in the marginalization of the Shudra participation, in this case of the Shaktadas, was due to their connection with the rising and the declining fortunes of the religious leader. We also find that there is a lot of assertion by other groups who are coming in during this period, primarily the Tatacharyas. In conclusion, what I was trying to make a point is that the temple brought together various social groups within a cohesive framework, and it also became a marker of settlement patterns, integrating several areas around it. It needs to be highlighted that the idea of a sacred center as a town, the notion of space, and the role of religious ideology in articulating a specific urban space becomes important to understand the urban growth. For economic factors do not only contribute towards urbanization and growth of towns only. The exceptionalism of a sacred center within urban studies raises certain questions, which are: does urbanization within the sacred centers involve specific processes that are unique to the sacred center only? How are sacred spaces and urban spaces different from secular spaces as urban spaces? In the history of urbanization of the Tamil region, one observes that a dichotomy between the sacred and the secular is not possible. Professor Dutta in her book has pointed this out, but her work is only till 14th century. Religion, in my opinion, is as much a part of the organization of a secular space as a secular space plays a significant role in the sacred center, and both interpenetrate each other. This is particularly true in the case of Srirangam, where urban space gradually came to be organized within the closer to the temples, which of course echoed the power and hierarchy of the town. It was also the cosmic center of religious ideas, where there was a lot of religious interaction. Such an outflow was not only within the precincts of the town, but also reached the ever-expanding hinterland. This dissemination was not a one-way process from Srirangam to the countryside. In fact, the town and the hinterland culturally influenced each other, and it brought within itself several groups under the Varna Jati paradigm. These groups also influenced the temple and the town's life of Srirangam with their ideas of religiosity and customs. This was reflected in the ever-expanding temple pantheon of the divinities and the power of these religious leaders who kept acquiring new disciples. Thus, to conclude, the approach of dichotomy between town and countryside, projecting a one-way transfer of resources from the agrarian hinterland to the town in urban studies, has limitations. Srirangam was neither a capital city nor a political center. Its influence was precisely because it was not only sacred, but it also generated commercial, economic, and social processes, which marked it as a sacred space as much as urban space, like any other commercial town of that period. Thank you.
request everyone behind to please maintain silence. Thank you, Dr. Dutta, for this very informative and engaging session. Your research and analysis were truly fascinating and provided our audience with valuable insights. I would now like to welcome our second speaker for the day, Professor Shalin Jain. Shalin Jain is presently Professor in Medieval Indian History at the Department of History, University of Jain. He has been postdoctoral fellow at Claremont Lincoln University, California, USA, under UGC Raman Fellowship Scheme for postdoctoral research in United States in 2013 and 14. He has published a monograph, Identity, Community and State, the Jains under the Mughals, and has several research papers in studies in history, Indian History Review, Social Scientists, and other history journals. His two research papers have been awarded Professor J.S. Garewal Prize for the best research paper in the medieval Indian history by the Indian History Congress. His research interests include social and religious history of medieval India, identity formation, environment and society. Today, he will be exploring Renovations and Contestations, Śatrunjaya through the ages. We welcome you, sir.
I'm sorry, but I really have to again announce that the acoustics of this room is such that the smallest murmur behind disturbs the speaker in the front. So please refrain from speaking while the lecture is on, please. Thank you.
And this request is on behalf of the whole Department of History.
Thank you very much. The theme of my paper today is Renovations and Contestations, Śatrunjaya through the ages. See, I have just very recently, I have started working on this theme. So there are going to be many loose ends into what I am going to speak on today. So I just look forward for suggestions for you so that I can further make deeper insights into it. Just a second, I'll just start with my timer of 20 minutes into it. That'll keep me within the bounds. Through this paper, what I am trying to attempt is to trace the genealogy of the contemporary history of the rapidly changing religious movements, demography, and morphologies, including that of Śatrunjaya. So this paper is primarily located within the South Asian medieval Kotturian culture, wherein the context of religious as well as sectarian pluralism raised sensitive questions about the public performance of religion as well as about the notions of community and the public realm. This study of Śatrunjaya, renowned for its Jain temples, is located next to the town of Palitana in Gujarat, an erstwhile princely state in the Saurashtra region of Gujarat. It examines the histories of the processes of renovation of this pilgrimage site, the patrons of patronage, and the practice of sacred rituals as symbols of social existence of medieval communities, with the premise that there has been a well-established conception of relationship between the state, community identity formation, and the pilgrimage sites. With a shared understanding that the process of identity formation can be traced, of course, not only in the literary genres, but also in the material production. The construction, patronage, expansion, ritualization, and importantly, destruction of the religious sites have unfolded the symbolic meanings attached to the religious spaces in medieval South Asia. However, to comprehend the operative relationship between religious structures and the group identity, a different sort of approach to the material and textual evidence, that is the relationship between the religious buildings and their narratives, is required. In this case too, an explanation of production of notions of Jain identity around such religious idioms not only explains the different orientations to power, but the meanings and the forms of crisis as well. While tracing the histories of the destruction or renovation, a vandalism on part of the colonial knowledge discourse looms large even over the post-colonial histories of Śatrunjaya perpetuating similar perceptions. Also, the name Śatrunjaya, that is the place of victory against the enemies, sounds to be organically ingraining the notion of self, other, and violence to it. Linguistically, the name itself, along with the histories woven around this place and its possession, sounds to be challenging the basic tenets of Jainism. However, for a devout Jain, this name does not signify any victory over any mortal force, but a triumph over the worldly attachment of the self. This very paradoxical situation remains tied to the multiple histories and narratives associated with the site of Śatrunjaya. Revisiting the sources takes us to an alternative perspective into hitherto undeveloped facets in the history of South Asian Jain community and its relationship with the state. One could discuss a number of multiple Jain attempts to proclaim and appropriate this sacred site. At the same time, these very sources give ample references that Śatrunjaya was also a site of controversy, a location to be claimed by the multiple stakeholders. The term renovation regularly emerges in the Jain literature referring to Śatrunjaya. This term would have been so significant simply because the destruction too would have been rampant. Here one can argue that the Jain religious site, apart from being a shared sacred space, was also the site capable of provoking potential tensions and conflicts. There have been claims and counterclaims and competition, dominion by any one sect or religious groups over the site has been resisted and countered. Within this context, we can analyze this sacred site as a discursive field to explore the fashioning of Jain religion and community's relationship with the state. The continuous tensions and conflicts over the possession of the site indicates how, for the Jains, constant renovations and pilgrimages to the site were also the tools of self-identification, constantly provoking their claim over the site. The hagiographical literature treats the occasion of rebuilding of Śatrunjaya, particularly after the temple desecrations, as moments of triumph of community on account of its pious members. This situation emerged due to multiple stakeholders to the site across a historical timeline, and one sees tensions between the Jain and the Savs, Jain and the Buddhists, Jain and Brahmins, within Jains, the Shvetambars and the Digambars, and within the Shvetambars, you have the Tapagach and the Kharkargach having their own claims over this site. All these claims over the site have been more the assertion of power relations rather than the sacrality of the site. Whenever any one of the particular stakeholders had access to power and state, they defeated the other party to acquire the site, and this has been the repeated story throughout the millennium. In the case of Śatrunjaya, here emerges two narratives. On the one hand, there are the descriptions highlighting the religious centrality of Śatrunjaya, the role of the patrons in associating the site with the community, and the religiosity invoked out of this relationship. On the other side, there are histories of claims, conflicts, force controls, making Śatrunjaya a site of continuous disputes and violence, reflecting the unwillingness of the multiple stakeholders of the site to assert the collective identity and existence of other groups, particularly the Jains. Here it is significant that disputes over the site of Śatrunjaya, they were violation of Jain community's fundamental ethics. Yet, in the face of this constant tension and hostility, Jain community and its leadership was in constant act of self-assertion through the continuous momentum of renovation of the site. Here, without any historical deviation from the norms and ethics of their religiosity, Jains were able to maneuver the temporal control over this symbolic, iconic sacred space of Śatrunjaya in a longue durée approach. The Jain beliefs and sense of association to the sacred site of Śatrunjaya indicates that the cultural performance of religiosity of a community in historical times connects and reproduces itself via certain symbols of physical sacred spaces. It involves an internally coherent construction of cognitive boundaries. Historically, identification, construction, patronage, expansion, and ritualization of the sacred sites invent a tradition to act as a special repertoires of the specific ritual culture of the identity formation. Textually, such practices pretend to be spiritually autonomous, but functionally they work in a closely knitted pragmatic scenario. So the worldview of the evolving Jain traditions requires to be situated via the temporality of Śatrunjaya as a part of the wider South Asian religious universe to provide a very specific understanding of the changing nature and meaning of sacrality and its crisis. How identities relate to the structure of the community and to its network of patronage is critical to understand how such identities gain social meanings and acceptance. Tensions associated with the nature of state patronage and occasions of larger conflicts generated images whose meanings and immediacy were inseparable from the reality of local particularized conflicts and competitions and concealed to a project of homogeneous community. Most of the Jain temples of Śatrunjaya were constructed between 1000 to 1300 CE when the Solanki ruling dynasty of Western India patronized the Jain religion. However, the construction of this temple complex spanned nearly 900 years. These temples were built in two phases. The first phase was from the 11th to 13th centuries and the second phase from 16th century onwards. Political uncertainties prevailed in this region during the 14th-15th centuries. Thus, temple construction activities were put on hold, though minor renovations and idol consecration continued. The existing temples are from the 16th century onwards, and Śatrunjaya is basically a Shwetambar sacred space with only one temple dedicated to the Digambars. Two significant literary works about this pilgrimage center are the Tirthkalp. Tirthkalps are basically the literature on the travel on the pilgrimage center as well as the travel accounts. The first kalp is in Prakrit. It was written by the Tathagata Acharya Dharam Ghosh Suri, and the second one, Vivid Tirthkalp in Sanskrit, was written by Khatargach monk Jin Suri. Yet for the construction of the genealogy and chronology of the place, Śatrunjaya Mahatmya is claimed to be the oldest Jain document dating back to 420 Common Era. The author of the Mahatmya claims to have converted King Shiladitya of Saurashtra, who was first a Jain but had been converted to Buddhism. In the initial reign of Shiladitya, Shwetambar Jains were expelled from the kingdom after getting defeated by Buddhists after a public intellectual disputation in his court. Buddhists got hold over Śatrunjaya and started worshipping the idols as Buddhist idols. The reign of successor King Kumarpal unfolds another controversial history of Śatrunjaya. The king, initially a strong follower of Saivism, after ascending the throne, came in touch with the celebrated Jain monk Hemchand Acharya. As per the legends, there was a competition between Hemchand and Brahmins to establish influence. However, through his charismatic and philosophical balancing, Hemchand could win over the king in favor of Jainism. The renovations and constructions at the site continued well into the medieval and early modern period. Rise of Śatrunjaya had political shadows too. The establishment of Delhi Sultanate and its expansion into the interior regions created a new challenge for the Indic religious communities. Hitherto living under the political patronage of the Rajput rulers, now these religious communities had their leadership to negotiate new power relations in the new political realities. Simultaneously, the political expansion also meant ample opportunities to control new resources as well as gaining social capital in terms of the networking with other socio-religious communities. Thus, except for political causes or individual iconoclasts, the practice of pilgrimage and renovation activities kept flourishing during the Sultanate period as well. The ritualization of pilgrimage and its textualization during this period became an important basis for the Jain religious identity. The ample availability of the Jain travel cum pilgrimage narratives available in Sanskrit and vernacular literature sought to map a landscape through the details of the pilgrimages undertaken to various sacred sites and praise the individuals who made such efforts. A wealthy merchant, Jagru Shah of Kutch, took a Jain congregation to Śatrunjaya in 1262. This practice was continued by Petran Shah of Mandavgarh in 1263, where he took a big congregation to Siddhachal and built a temple of Tirthankar Shantinath. Another Sanskrit text, Nadi Nandan Udhar Prabandh of Katka Suri of 1335, it details the pious deeds of the Gujarati Jain merchant Samra Shah. This Samra Shah had a friend and a well-wisher, Al Khan, who was the then governor of Gujarat during Alauddin Khalji's period. Al Khan allowed Samra Shah to build the temple of Adinath at Palitana. He also received the permission for the renovation of Śatrunjaya from Alauddin Khalji. Vivid Tirthal of Jain Prof. Suri, a contemporary text, contemporary to Samra Shah, narrates that the Mool Nayak, that is the male idol of the Adishur temple of Śatrunjaya, was built by the merchant in 1314 after it was destroyed by the Malik. A hagiographical text, Khardarkash Brihad Guruvavali, also details the military campaigns of the Sultanate and its effects as Malik Samkule, that is the devastations caused by the Malik. Yet the Khardarkash Acharya Jain Chandra Suri, with his devoted followers, could afford to travel and visit every important Jain tirth of northwestern India in the first 2 decades of the 14th century. Jain Chand passed away in 1319 and was succeeded by Jain Kushal Suri. His followers at Delhi could successfully obtain a farman from Padshahi Shri Gyasuddin Maharaj Raj to visit the 2 great pilgrimage tirths of Śatrunjaya and Ujjain. The Acharya led the Sangh Yatra. Sangh Yatra are basically the mass pilgrimages that are taken out by the Jains with the aim of Shri Jain Shashan Prabhavnakaran, that is to spread the rule of Jina. Acharya Jain Kushal was accompanied by the Jain followers of Delhi, amongst whom Thakkar Feru, the celebrated Jain treasurer of Sultans of Delhi, particularly Sultan Alauddin Khalji, was the most prominent. Similarly, an affluent Jain of Delhi, Dharam Singh Shriman, secured a farman from Gyasuddin Tughlaq in favor of his father Shri Raipati to lead a contingent of Jains on pilgrimage to Śatrunjaya, and he was also provided a royal escort of the Sultanate troops. Acharya Jain Prabh, who was author of Vivid Tirthal, was the most influential Jain personality in the 14th century. Raising the concerns about the politics of his age, Jain Prabh Suri made a journal appeal not to interfere with those who would go on pilgrimage or perform ascetic practices on Śatrunjaya, while praising those who supported them. He also described the destruction and renovation of various idols at Śatrunjaya. His attitude towards the destruction of images by the barbarians, repeatedly mentioned in the text, seems to reflect a certain acceptance that such events were bound to happen due to the Kali Yuga, that is the degenerated age in which they lived. Rather, he says that it became an opportunity for the Jains then to acquire the everlasting religious merit by restoring these images and temples. The final verse of the first chapter of Śatrunjaya Kalp of Vivid Tirthal is addressed specifically to Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, saying, "The King of Kings has been pleased by my beginning of this, and so this Kalp, that is chapter, will always remain be as victorious as the grace of the King." Due to his knowledge and skills, the Suri so much impressed Sultan that he was granted a favor for the protection of the Jain pilgrimages at Śatrunjaya, Girnar and Falun. Though the role of temple as public institution has been relegated to the tradition of ritualistic worship, yet reproduction of community too was a task moving around the temple, thus legitimizing the physical existence over a period of time. The series of temple renovations at Śatrunjaya clearly establishes a close interaction and political engagement between the Jain Sangh and the royalty during the pre-Mughal period. Samra Shah's temple at Śatrunjaya was renovated by another Jain, Karma Shah of Chittor in 1531. This Karma Shah developed personal relationship with Qutubuddin Bahadur Shah, the then Prince of Gujarat, and this bond between the two evolved into friendship. In 1526, this Bahadur Shah became king of Gujarat, and Karma Shah would provide finances to the state. Karma Shah requested Bahadur Shah to grant him farman to allow him to repair the temple on Śatrunjaya Hills, which was duly granted. This event indicates mutual interdependencies of the Jain financiers and the Muslim rulers unto each other and its religious outcomes. Another narrative of 16th century explicitly brings out the process of religious invocation for a pilgrimage by Jain Pontiff Jain Chandra Suri and the material support that was provided to them by the Jain trader brothers of Ahmedabad, Somji and Shivaji. Jain Chand bestowed Somji with the title of Sanghapati. Sanghapati is basically a title that is bestowed on a Jain affluent who engages in the consecration of the temples, idol installations, and who takes out the Sangyatras. Mirate Ahmadi also mentions that a Shravak Baniya by the name of Somji, who built this temple of Śatrunjaya, spent nearly ₹17 lakh on it. Here one can argue that the Jain religious sites, apart from being shared sacred spaces, were also the sites capable of provoking potential tensions and conflicts. Within this context, we can analyze these sites as discursive fields to explore the medieval Jain community's relationship with the medieval state through the sacred site of Śatrunjaya. The control of the site remained not only an issue of contention between the Shwetambar and Digambars, but even among the Shwetambars who were wielding influence in the Mughal court, the control over Śatrunjaya was an issue of prestige. Particularly extant narrative about the tension and conflict between the Dabagach and Khartargach pertaining to control over the Jain sacred spaces, especially Śatrunjaya, finds mentions in Jain literature like Shri Bhanuchandra Ganicharitam, Karamchand Vanshkukiram, Kavyam. There are a host of inscriptions from Śatrunjaya, and as well as extant imperial Mughal firmans from Akbar to the period of Aurangzeb. We all know that that Jahangir had an ambivalent attitude towards the Jains, but still what we find is that in Śatrunjaya there are nearly 7 inscriptions where we find reference to Jahangir, and also one of the inscriptions that is dedicated to Khurram, that is Prince Khurram. He is mentioned as Shahiyan Sultan, and interestingly in March 1660, Aurangzeb issued a farman. Now this farman doesn't come to the Jain monks or to the community as a whole, but this farman of Aurangzeb goes to a particular individual, Shantidas Jori. This Shantidas Jori was a 17th century commercial affluent from Ahmedabad, and interesting is that this whole site of Śatrunjaya on the Palitana hills, along with the hills of Abuji, which was under the Sirohi rulers, was also granted to Shantidas. The local power relations too played significant role in the politics of control over Śatrunjaya. The Gohil Rajput chiefs of Palitana were given the charge of the hill by Shantidas on the condition that they will preserve to the Shravaks the free exercise of their religious observance. However, this small Hindu principality, popularly known as the Palitana Darbar, both under the Mughals and afterwards the British, constantly tried to encroach upon this temple complex, claiming that this region falls in its territory. Thus, as a right of territorial sovereignty, they tried to impose custom duties and stop Jains from maintaining the structure around and inside the temple complex. In 1750, the Palitana chieftains entered into an agreement with the Jain community for a moderate annual contribution in view of protection of the visiting Jains and the hill. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, this protection money remained a controversy between the Palitana Darbar and the Jain community. To conclude, the study of Śatrunjaya as a religious site shows that across time, spiritual processes of religiosity and inner self of the Jain community, they were drawn upon the temporality of temple consecration, idol installation, renovations, and pilgrimages. The renovation of the temples, destroyed either by the natural calamities or by invasions, symbolized the persistent claims of the community over the site. Through such acts at the religious sites like Śatrunjaya, Jains, instead of being just given religious entity, were reproducing themselves as a community on day-to-day basis. The religious symbols were used as forms of social manipulation and material justification. Simultaneously, one requires being cautious about the mundane objectives of the Jain sources, as these normative texts were not meant to pay attention to the social, geographical, and the temporal context in their approaches to community-state relationship, and thus they had to be either vague or eulogizing in their identification of the historical actors. In fact, by organizing the Sangyatras, temple buildings, festivals, rituals, affluent Jains of the religious community not only refashioned and reconstituted their religious social authority, but also initiated a social process by which individuals became part of the community. Through these different levels of social networks, unlike other historical religious communities, Jain religious remembrance could suppress the historical memories of violence, counterclaims, and tensions, subverting them to the level of de-excitation of their pilgrimage sites and community itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jain, for your enlightening presentation on the rich history and cultural significance of Śatrunjaya, providing valuable insights into the various renovations and contestations that have taken place over the years. I would now like to introduce our third speaker for this session, Dr. Patrick Felix Krüger. Dr. Krüger studied art history of South and East Asia at University of Berlin and ancient and medieval history of South Asia at Humboldt University of Berlin. He received his PhD in art history of South Asia with a thesis on illustrated Jain manuscripts from the early modern period. In 2016, he was the research fellow of the Kate Hamburger column Dynamics in the History of Religion Between Asia and Europe at the Center for Religious Studies, CERES, University of Bochum, where he currently works as a research associate. He also served as interim professor of religious studies at the University of Münster. He has also curated exhibitions on the history of religion, Jain miniature, and Jain art and religion in Münster, Cologne, and Zurich. Today, Dr. Krüger will be discussing Jina and Jina image, how images contribute to the construction of religious founder figures, through a pre-recorded session due to connectivity issues.
Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Germany. Before I start, let me just take the opportunity to express my thanks to the organizers of this conference. I am delighted to have the chance to participate in this conference and to congratulate the Department of History and its members to the anniversary of its establishment. In my presentation today, I will discuss in which way images contributed to the construction of founder figures and thus to the formation of religious identities, or possibly even generated these identities in individual cases. In other words, how was the Jina transformed from a human who seeks a path to salvation and founds an ascetic order into a deified supernatural being whose image became a cult object worshipped by his lay followers? I begin with some methodological issues. In simple terms, Jainism is a salvation doctrine based on the teachings of the Jina Mahavira, or in a broader context, an eternal law based on the teachings of 24 Tirthankaras who appear in each world age. That is the religious or ethnic perspective. From a historical perspective, we need to distinguish more carefully between specific levels and stages of development. From a religious point of view, Jainism was completed after Mahavira proclaimed his doctrine on the basis of the omniscience he had attained. But from the perspective of history of religion, the formation of Jainism was a long process, and in each period, Jainism had different appearance, although some basic assumptions were fixed. It is obvious that social change leads to changes in the discourse. This results in controversies about how religion should respond to the changing realities. In the process, the theological interpretation may result in an adjustment of beliefs, or it may result in splits among the communities. That is how religious history emerges, and it is in this context that I will look at Jainism and the Jina. Jainism is generally identified as one of the religion traditions founded by an individual person. Even though the founder himself may not be traceable on the historical level, the doctrines and the religious movement based on it focus on the founder and on how he attained salvation. If the term Jina is used without any further specification, it usually refers to the last Tirthankara Mahavira, who is regarded by his followers less as a historical figure than as a mythical saint. The attempt to include the Jina as a historical figure in the predominantly Western historiography is an idea of European scholars of the 19th century. In consequence, the current perception of the Jina, sometimes even in academic literature, merges history, legends, and religious beliefs. In order to gain a more detailed insight into the figure of the Jina, several levels of development must be distinguished. I present here a simplified model. The first level is the historical founder of the community from which Jainism emerged. This was a human who gathered followers around him and perhaps preached a doctrine. We have no historical records from this founding period of Jainism. Only what is reflected in literature enables us to examine the Jina as a historical figure presented by Jain literature. So the second level is the Jina as described in early literary sources. The third level then is the deified Jina, who is described as the first among the deities in later literature. And finally, the fourth level is the visual representation of the Jina in art, which I will not discuss in this paper. It also has to be taken into account that the Jina was expanded from a single founder of a religion to the model of 24 Tirthankaras. So I roughly distinguish between the unknown historical founder, the mythical human Jina, and the deified Jina, who is a godlike supernatural being in a way. What do we know about the historical founder? The founder of the ascetic movement from which the Jain community arose probably lived around the middle of the first millennium BC in a period of great social change. Numerous preachers traveled to North India during this period, each propagating his particular doctrine. Nothing is known about the origin and the life of this particular preacher. Whether he developed his teachings himself or drew on other older doctrines of salvations which he modified to suit the demands of the day is impossible to decide with any degree of historical accuracy. The members of the ascetic community, which according to a later tradition was founded by Vardhamana Mahavira and probably was run by his disciples after him, were not interested in the story of their teacher's life. For them, it was more important to memorize his teachings and the way to salvation it promoted. This may be the reason why knowledge about the founding teacher and his life was not kept, and no anecdotes and events from his life were collected and transmitted. It is possible that he himself did not want to be in the center of attention, but preferred to focus on his teachings. Maybe he did not consider himself the founder of a new movement, but rather the reformer of an already existing school of thought. But no matter whether we are inclined to consider him the founder or the reformer, and whether his name was Mahavira or Parshva, historical sources are silent about the founder of Jainism. It is possible that Jainism began its existence as a compilation of different doctrines of salvation, which only later were attributed to one founder, as R. Mette, scholar of Jain studies from Munich University, suggested a couple of years ago. We have to concede, therefore, that neither the circumstances that lead to the creation of the Jain doctrine, nor the people who were involved in this process can be identified due to the lack of authentic contemporary sources. The historical founder of Jainism, therefore, remains elusive. The Jina legend replaces this unknown founder with the idealized figure of the mythical Jina. And this is the level of literature. Even though the Jina is a historical figure remains elusive, Jain literature contains a large number of legends concerning his life and activities. If these sources are consulted for an analysis of the creation and early development of the Jain doctrine, they provide the image of an idealized Jina figure which was created long after the earliest Jain communities came into existence, and that served to glorify the founder figure. The authors of this legend almost certainly did not encounter the founder, and probably not even his immediate disciples. At which point of time the Jina legend was first formulated remains unknown. Its emergence usually is attributed to the realization by Jain missionaries that they were at a disadvantage compared to their Buddhist rivals, who already had such a legend narrating events from the life of their founder. The Jina legend became the starting point for the development of a mythical being. It makes him a far-removed teacher whose doctrine of salvation is transmitted and whose way of life was regarded as an example. Later versions of the Jina legend describes the life of altogether 24 Tirthankaras of the current era, beginning with their birth and ending with their salvation. All these descriptions follow a pattern dictated by the events in the life of the last Jina, Mahavira. In this context, the borders are blurred between the mythical Jina, who is venerated by his followers as a glorified religious leader, and the deified Jina, who in compliance with the eternal order of the universe appears at fixed point in the course of time as one in a sequence of 24 redeemers, other figures like heroes and worldly rulers, to re-establish the knowledge of the doctrine and to attain salvation after proclaiming these teachings. From the point of view of religious studies, the idea of the Jina as the glorified founder of Jainism predates the concept of the deified Jina. It is, however, almost impossible to distinguish both levels because religious doctrines are constantly developing and transitions only lead to clear breaks if they are the reason for divisions of the followers. The problem of differentiation also exists regarding the historical Jina. It concerns those episodes of the legend which maybe were fragments of the life story of the historical founding figure, but are no longer traceable using the means of the historian. With regard to Mahavira, his existence may be documented indirectly by Buddhist literary sources. These texts are probably older than the Jina legend, as the name Nayaputra used for Mahavira in the sources indicates. The authors of the Jina legend were no longer familiar with this name. But again, this is the level of history of literature. The formation of the deified Jina is based on the ideas of the mythical saint. It is therefore possible to regard the mythical Jina as one step on the way to a deified Jina. The earliest version of the Jina legend is transmitted in the Bhavana chapter of the Acharanga Sutra. This text contains only the description of the life of Mahavira, including episodes from his life as a prince Vardhamana, who grew up in his parents' palace and after their death renounced the world to become an ascetic. After years of strict asceticism, he attained omniscience and, at his death, salvation. This mythical Jina is therefore a human being who, according to tradition, decided to give up mundane life of his own accord. Thus, he obtained superior knowledge that enabled him to overcome the cycle of rebirths on his own. The supportive interventions of deities, described in later versions of the Jina legend, were of no importance to the mythical Jina, since in his world, if they had any importance at all, deities only influence worldly matters. This attitude is reflected in Jain monasticism. Here, the ability to achieve salvation without any external support has never been questioned. In the Jina legend, however, the mythical Jina is partly superimposed by a third level, the deified Jina. Since at least the second half of the first millennium CE, the mythical founder was transformed into the deified renovator of the doctrine. While the mythical Jina is perceived as a human being who out of his own initiative achieved salvation, the deified Jina is a part of the world order. He is now just one of the 24 Jinas whose periodical appearance in the course of each era is predetermined. Mahavira in this tradition is no longer the founder or reformer of his own doctrine of salvation, but rather the last preacher of an eternal doctrine. The concept of the deified Jina is connected to the idea of 24 Jinas already at an early stage. It is still uncertain when this idea first manifested itself, since the development leading to the group of Jinas is not documented in Jain literature. Early Jain cult steles depicting 4-standing Jinas suggest that the concept of the 24 Jinas was preceded by a tradition including a group of 4 Jinas. This was expanded at a later stage. The Kalpa Sutra also elaborates the lives of only 4 Jinas. They are Mahavira, Parshva, Arishtanemi, and Rishabha. Each of them has a particular function in the Jina legends. Mahavira revised the monastic rules formulated by Parshva. In this concept, he is both founder and reformer of the Jain religion. Parshva thus takes the position of a Stavira who provides the basis for Mahavira and his new rules. Parshva's predecessor, Arishtanemi, is, according to the legend, a relative of the Hindu deity Krishna. In this position, he connected Jaina and Brahmanical mythology. The intention behind this was probably to include and subordinate the rising of Brahmanical cults. Rishabha finally takes a position similar to that of the Brahmanical Manus as a progenitor who trains mankind in different arts and crafts. For the Vaishnavas, he is a manifestation of Vishnu, which may indicate a Brahmanical attempt to proselytize the Jainas. Mahavira, Parshva, Arishtanemi, and Rishabha for a long period are the most frequently represented Jinas, while the number of depictions, including all 24 Jinas in one image, increases only by the 10th centuries in Western India. It should also be emphasized at this point that only 4 of the Jinas, Mahavira, Parshva, Suparshva, and Rishabha, can clearly identified due to their attributes or individual features. The sequence of 24 Jinas, whose lives and ways to salvation are almost identical and who are venerated in more or less identical cult images, places Jainism in a line with ancient Indian tradition. According to this concept, the doctrine of salvation is not the result of a lengthy search by an individual and thus a new discovery, but rather a compilation of several different doctrines, each of which goes back to the search of countless ascetics and mystics. Already the Upanishads and epics refer to them. The process of deification occurs on a linguistic level by the use of metaphors. The construction of supernatural events and divine beings must necessarily make use of metaphorical language. There is no vocabulary that refers exclusively to the transcendent level. Instead, there is navigation between the source and the target domain, allowing the intangible, unknown, transcendent world to be described in terms from the world on this side. How this works is being researched at the University of Bochum in an interdisciplinary project on metaphors as the language of religion. The deified Jina holds the highest rank within the Jain pantheon, even above the gods. The omniscience of the mythical Jina in his figure is further developed into a notion of all-encompassing power, which makes him the god among the gods, Deva Adideva in Sanskrit, and the spiritual ruler of the three worlds. To sum up, the image that presents itself is the following. The historical Jina may have been promoting a doctrine of salvation that was directed against the existing order. The mythical Jina, as described in literary sources, is a human who overcomes the order of the world and withdraws from the cycle of rebirths by renunciation. Finally, the deified Jina himself becomes part of the cycling revolving order of the universe. His appearance no longer is a unique event, but happens again and again and is accompanied by supporting deities who bow to the Tirthankara. As already mentioned, the founder of Jainism, the real founder of Jainism, cannot be traced in history. Therefore, the question arises whether, from a historical perspective, such an individual founder figure is indispensable for the emergence of Jainism, and whether the emergence of the Jain religion is also conceivable without such a founding figure. A convincing model for the process of deification of religious founder figures has been suggested by Max Scheler. According to him, the deification of the founder is the transformation from a spiritual leader and his doctrine from the subject to an object of religion. The originally human founder becomes a superhuman being and is thus at the same time elevated and alienated from his followers. They no longer have to follow the paragon, but reduce their action to the veneration of the religious subject. This is a relief for the followers because the long and difficult path to salvation is replaced by a fixed ritual. In his model of deification, Scheler entirely omits the material level. It is not sufficient to transform only the imagined or constructed founder on an intellectual level into the object of religion. The intellectual subject demands a material object, an image that serves as the place of manifestation for the subject. It is not always an object of veneration or cultic practices. Often it is sufficient to form a sign or symbol as a reference to the deified founder. Although Scheler develops his argument based on actually existing founding figures, his model can equally be applied to Jainism, where the existence of an actual founder remains, as mentioned before, unproven. In this case, the paragon, that is the ideal to be followed, is expressed in the doctrine, and for the laity, the veneration of this doctrine replaced renunciation. The Jina, a spiritual teacher and ideal ascetic, served as a visualization of the doctrine. It promoted the program and practice of the doctrine at the same time. It is not the founder, but the representation of an imagined ideal founder that was transformed into the subject of the religion and was venerated by Jain laity. This suggestive force of the image probably was instrumental in the formation of a Jain identity among the laity. It went beyond what the programmatic teachings of the ascetic order could provide. Scheler supposes that the pressure of the masses, that means the rapid growth of the religious community, caused the deification. The strong growth of the Jain lay community seems probable since the increasing numbers of images were probably paid for by the laity. Early Jain scripture deal only with the concerns of the ascetics, who according to the monks' rules were without possessions and do not mention religious images. To come to a conclusion, it can be said that the idea of the Jina is very complex. Although he is often understood as a historical founder, the Jina who has come down to us is first and foremost a literary figure. The development of the Jina from the presumed founder of the religion to a divine being occurs primarily in literature, but is entangled with the religious beliefs of the laity and their practice of worship. A changing perspective on the Jina allows us to draw conclusions about the structure of the community and the changing weighting of laymen and ascetics within it. Thank you very much.
I would now invite the chair for this session, Professor Vijayalaxmi, along with our speakers to join us on stage. Professor Singh would now be sharing her insights about this session with us.
Conversation, or I would say paper presentation from Ranjeeta, Shalin and Dr. Krüger. The papers were very vibrant and they were giving insight of the sacred spaces, sacred places, and also the sacred persons like Jina. These are, they also spoke about the religiosity of these sacred spaces or places which are undermined in the when we discuss the growth of city. They are not rightly placed, not discussed, which they have raised about, and the contestation in these places which take place from time to time regarding the sacrality of these places, or the mic is on.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Sacrality of these places, or the importance of these places. The importance of these places within the city, the framework of the growth of the city, which is generally not given importance by the historians have not been given importance by the historians, but now the historians, looking for more and more sources, have gone to these sites, sacred sites, and recovered the historicity of these sacred sites. So this is what Ranjeeta and Dr. Ranjeeta and Professor Shalin Jain has been pointing out regarding to their sphere of knowledge, or their sphere of research on Srirangam, or this Śatrunjaya. And Professor Krüger's comment or research on the Jina, the various aspects of historicity of Jina. Jina taken as a historical figure, Jina taken as individuals, ruler, or Jina taken at various spheres. That is also, pointing towards the importance of historicity of the sacred persons, which lately try to bring out. So overall, I feel that it is enlightening for the students and teachers to enter into the realm of sacred spheres or religiosity of the historical aspects of the religiosity of these places. So I congratulate all of them, all three of them, Dr. Ranjeeta, Professor Shalin, and Dr. Krüger, for presenting such beautiful papers in front of all of us. Thank you.
The house is now open for a Q&A session.
My question is for Ranjeeta. Ranjeeta, I take your point that the sacred and the secular are difficult to distinguish. I just want to know whether there are any, whether you have, I'm sure you do, but you didn't mention non-religious, non-agrarian references to participation in the temple by communities like merchants and others. And to Professor Shalin, I thought, are there different phases in first rejection of the other, and then acceptance or maybe expediency of interaction, and then maybe a much more reciprocal relationship? Can we see these kind of three phases? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parashar, for your question. Actually, what I presented is a part of what would be a town's life. Because my unease with categories of cities and towns is very strong. And when we have an uneasiness with categorizing towns and cities, then we are asked what is the alternative. So one is grappling with that. Where this particular sacred town, and I don't like to use the word sacred town because the people who were living there never thought about the town as just a sacred center. It's in their background. Even when you visit it today, they don't think it is a sacred. It means different things to different people. So there are, of course, like most people who are trying to make forays into urbanization, I have also been very, very impressed by Lefebvre and David Harvey's, context of the right to the city. And when we look at the inscriptions, there are several references to artisans, craftsmen, and merchants coming. And to say that they are just exclusively Sri Vaishnavas is also incorrect because they are making donations to the Shaiva temples, to the Durga temples elsewhere, all over the southern region, including the Deccan. So there are references, but I did not bring this in this presentation because I just thought I'll bring a part of it, which is the religious, leaders. And I must admit, my own, slow pace to also warm up to the idea that there are non-religious actors who are also very, very crucial, in this kind of an organization. So there are, and in fact, I presented in 21 in Delhi University here, where I actually talked about the craftsmen and their concept of, or their idea of what a city is, because a city or a town is also a space of inequalities. So how they're grappling with that and how they react to it is something which I presented. But I couldn't bring it here because I just thought I'd focus on one thing which I'm a little more comfortable with. Thank you.
So my question is...
Can I just respond? Please. Sorry. Yes, Professor Parashar, we do see there are different phases of interaction and encounters. But what we have to understand is that when we look at these interactions, the power remains the same. Right? You have actors who differs them. Now, what sort of actors they are? Say, for example, in case the actors can be specifically from the case of the Jain community. So in that case, the actors kept on shifting If I take example from the early modern period, particularly from the Mughals, if one looks from the time of Akbar till Jahangir, what we find is that, see, it remains the same, the Mughals, the power structure, fine, structures are same. So now these actors kept changing, right? Within the court of Akbar till Jahangir, you have the Jain community being represented by the spiritual agents. But from the time of Shah Jahan onwards, there is a shift in, and now the Jain community is not being represented by the spiritualists, but more by the affluent members of the Jain community, particularly the mercantile class. Say, in the case of region like Śatrunjaya, whether it were the sultans of Delhi, or they were the local Rajput rulers, or later on the Mughals, one thing remained very important for any of these powers was to tap on the resources, which was naturally very rich resource, this whole region, and also in case of, as I said, to tap on the social capital. They have the chance to get a tap over the various socio-religious communities that exist. So there are different phases, but we have to look into the actors actually who are interacting with the parts. Please.
My question is to Dr. Ranjeeta. Thank you very much for your such an informative talk. So, two small queries I have. One is partly addressed to ma'am question. Is that tag of temple city? Is it your discomfort with the tag in the context of this particular city only or in general also? You are uncomfortable with this tag, number one. And number two, is there any better tag for the cities where temple tends to be an important contributor in the urban processes? This is number one. And number two is, at one place in your lecture you commented that it was a time of large-scale migration to Tamil land. So, madam, whatever little understanding of history I have, I think that has been the case throughout the history. Migrations, whether forced or intentional, have been part of Indian history and history in other parts of the world also, I'm very much sure. So, was there some exceptional, factors, new reasons which were instigating this migration to Tamil land particularly? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions. Yes, I have a discomfort with the word temple city because I feel it essentializes, urban spaces. In general, the word holy city, because when we start studying it from the point of its sacrality, then we focus on certain aspects and leave out certain aspects. I particularly found this also in the case of other centers like Banaras, for example, where there is a large production of writings which are talking about one aspect, which is largely the religiosity, etc., etc. Some about, its association with certain ideas, some with association with certain communities who were a little more egalitarian and so on. But I generally feel that it leaves out other aspects of Banaras and other actors, other historical actors like the weavers and others as the agency. They are there, but they are always shown as people who are being manipulated and who are being taken in. It is a problem when we do this with the sacred towns because we are so much imbued by the idea of sacrality, heritage. Srirangam is currently a UNESCO heritage town. And it doesn't affect the life of the people there on an everyday basis because to my own surprise, when I was carrying this baggage to my field trip, a large number of young people live there who travel to Trichy. They are IT, software professionals. They have very little to do with it. It's there in the background, they know it's very important. So I do have a major discomfort with categorizing cities, to some extent. Whether there is a better tag, I really don't know, and I'm not sure whether, I don't know, this is a situation in the urban studies as how to get out of these tags, and this needs a little more, reading and a little more discussion. So I'm still grappling with this, So I haven't haven't reached a conclusion, but I try to raise my uneasiness and my discomfort now. Now, where migration is concerned, why I state this? Because in the 14th century, with the rise of the Vijayanagar Empire in the Deccan region, these are, and also there is Kakatiyas before that, and the Hoysalas, these are regions of very, very slim resource base. They hardly receive rainfall, agricultural production is not very high, so they're constantly looking for areas which can give them resources, and that's why they were also looking at the wedge regions, the deltaic regions, and also newer areas of agrarian expansion, which the southern regions, that is not only Tamil Nadu, present day Tamil Nadu, but Karnataka, Andhra, they all provided the southern part. So there is a constant migration because this is a period where the economy is also expanding. The context is of course from the 13th century when you have the saturation of the agrarian pockets, particularly in the wetland areas, and opening of dry land and semi-arid lands which are opened up. So you need tank diggers, you need specialists, toddy tappers, and this opportunity which is being provided is also through the migrants who are coming there. So you have the Reddys, the Naidus, the Parayas, they're all migrating, and this migration is just not one way, it's two ways also. People from the Tamil region also migrate to Deccan, particularly those who are looking for, for their career as militarists. Because Deccan provided a very fertile ground for mercenaries. So there's a migration that way also. A lot of Brahmins start migrating because the Brahmadeyas, which were receiving royal patronage, were no longer receiving royal patronage. In fact, in Srirangam only we find a lot of these Brahmadeyas are now getting dissolved, and the Brahmins are selling it to the temple, the land to the temple, and are migrating. So migration, all migrations, it is true that historically migrations keep taking place, but each of these phenomena have a specific historical context, which I could not elaborate because obviously it would take a lot of time, and I'm also very repetitive about this. I keep saying it everywhere, so I got a little tired. So the context is very important. The phenomenon of migration is there, but the context is. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's tea time. We can have a session over tea.
I agree with what you're saying, that nomenclature and this type of wisdom. But I also feel that we can't dismiss the notion of sacrality, which is associated with particular space. And the moment we dismiss that, we are actually sort of brushing away something which is larger than life and very, very, it's sort of permeating in every aspect, even in the so-called actors who are doing other activities or IT professionals and all. And if you see the concept of the Braj movie, or even Banaras, for example, so while the temple is a part of the life, but the notion of sacrality of that region permeates almost every level. And the moment we say that we don't, there are so many other activities. Obviously, there are so many other activities, and it's not so. But that idea of sacrality which gets associated with a place and which permeates almost every section of society, all the actors, non-actors who are not involved in the temple, is something we cannot rush. And that's my personal opinion.
No, I agree. Just a short response. I agree with you completely. My point is that it's always this or that. It's either the sacredness or let us say just the economic factors. So that is what I have.
In fact, a lot of the economy is deriving from tapping into the sacrality.
Yes, sometimes no. I mean, they're all things. So I think it should be a combination of the two. And that is what I am actually trying to say. That yes, when we try to make a case of a one, we do override the importance of the other, which should not be done. So there I agree with you. Sacredness, it is a sacred town. There's no denying of the fact. But the sacred town is just not a sacred town, because we then essentialize it, ultimately led to the categorization of temple city, which just narrows everything to the temples. One temple, I haven't discussed that there are 3 more temples around. which are in constant friction with each other, because it's much more than that, you know. Even the sacredness is also just not visiting the temple and generating
I understand even
spirituality.
the sacredness is layered, because if you see, for example, Julia Shaw's work on Kranti, so there's so much, you know, there's the Naga cards, the local cards, there is Buddhism, there's Brahmanism. I'm just giving an example from it. Sorry. So, you know, you have, even sacrality is not uniform, as you're saying, they're competing temples and it's layered. So, I don't know, somehow I feel that we have, you cannot, I mean, although one would like to see that there are many other forces, but sometimes the notion and the idea of sacrality is so impregnated that it almost permeates every level of and every section of society.
Pointing.
That's
As we bring this enlightening session to a close, it is our pleasure to invite Professor Syed Zahir Hussain Jafri to join us on stage for the felicitation ceremony. We would like to extend our gratitude to our esteemed chair, Professor Vijayalaxmi Singh, and all our remarkable speakers who have graced us with their invaluable insights and knowledge. We would now be having a very short 10-minute tea break. I would request students to be patient and first give way to our speakers and